So I want to start by saying that almost every slide in this presentation will have a citation to the primary literature where the information that I'm sharing with came from. I will send a PDF of this to the organizers at the end of the seminar so that anyone who would like to pursue any of these topics further or read the primary literature themselves, please feel free to. Sorry, I have to figure out how to advance. All right. So one of the questions is, why do we have issues with diversity, equity, and inclusion in STEM? Why is it that we actually see underrepresentation of some group in these STEM fields? One of the things we know is that it's not a problem of ability or desire. And we know that there's a lot of discrepancies. And one of them is that particularly pay is often less for people who are not white and male. We do know that self-doubt affects ability, and there's also this idea of a leaky pipeline in academia, and I will actually expand on that in just a moment. One thing we know is that we are not going to fix this issue unless underrepresented groups stand up for equal opportunity across all of these fields. But at the same time, and maybe just as valuable, we need overrepresented groups to recognize that this is an issue and to also actively work to support underrepresented people and get them engaged and included in STEM fields. So what is diversity, equity, and inclusion? First, we'll start with some definitions of each word. Diversity is clearly the representation of all our varied identities and differences, and there's a whole suite of ways in which this can be expressed. So all of these axes are important, and these can be collectively or as individuals. And of course, things like race, ethnicity, gender, disability, sexual orientation, gender identity, national origin, tribe, caste, socioeconomic status, thinking and communication styles, etc., are all important to think about. Equity is ensuring that you have fair treatment and equal opportunity and fairness and access to information for everyone. And lastly, inclusion builds on a culture of belonging by actively inviting the contribution and participation of all people in their forms of which they express themselves. And so not asking them to come as you expect them to be, but allowing them to come as the individuals that they are. Now, one thing I think that's a misconception is that people often think that if you fix one, you fix all. So if you hit some kind of diversity metric, it doesn't mean that your work is done. Just because you now have some amount of diversity in your community or in your department, it doesn't mean that you actually have equity or inclusion. And so you have to actively work to make sure that you provide an atmosphere in which these different perspectives and values are actually welcome and encouraged. One thing you'll often hear people talk about is unconscious or implicit bias. And these are important terms to think about because implicit bias refers to these attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, action, and decisions in an unconscious manner. And these actually can have really big impacts. One thing we do know is that they're activated involuntarily, unconsciously, and usually without one's awareness or intentional control. Implicit bias are robust and pervasive. And everyone is susceptible to them. Even people who are in fields where they're supposed to be objective or impartial, we know that you can actually have your implicit biases impacting your decision making. And they've even been documented in children. And one thing I would actually encourage you all to do is to go to this online series of tests that you can take to actually learn about where your implicit biases are. Everyone has them. And so this Harvard website has a whole suite of implicit bias tests you can take across almost every axis of diversity that you can imagine so that you get a better understanding of your own implicit biases. And I'll actually talk about how you can overcome some of these. I'm sorry?
Corrie, it's Richie. I just want to jump in and say that in fact, everybody in our center has done the implicit bias test.
Excellent.
But we don't often talk enough about why. So it's very helpful to hear you say something.
Oh, great. Yeah, and it's actually, and we'll talk about why you should actually know about where your implicit biases are a little later in the talk. So what is this idea of a leaky pipeline? Well, one of the things we know is that we start at sort of the earliest career stages, in particular at undergraduate level. When we look at who's enrolled or involved in STEM fields, we can see that our undergraduates are about 50-50 male and women. And so in this case, we're going to talk about the leaky pipeline in the context of women. And once we sort of move up these academic ranks towards PhD students, we see that we're losing a little bit more of these of that gender diversity at every step. And so finally, when we get to sort of full professors or even maybe National Academy members, we're down to a very low percentage of the population that are women that are still contributing to STEM fields. And so this is sort of this idea that at every sort of part of this pipeline through a career in academia, we're losing a lot of the strength that women would bring. So why focus on bias against women? I would argue that we actually have a lot of reasons to think about it. We know that we have unconscious and implicit bias, and that this can be both by men and women against women. And women are more likely to be subjected to inappropriate and sexual comments and advances. And since women are lost at every level, this idea of the leaky pipeline, we all have to work to encourage or retain them. And also say that we have the most data on women in science and their equity and inclusion in STEM fields, but it's also a gateway conversation. And so I think what we'll learn by looking at the literature around issues of women in science or STEM fields in general, we'll also see that many of those same patterns play out across other axes of diversity. So, you know, I'd argue that really anything we learn from studying the impact of women in STEM actually is equal or amplified in other underrepresented groups. So if we look at all jobs across the US, we can see that it's almost equal for men and women participating. But if we actually look at STEM jobs, suddenly we see that women are incredibly underrepresented in this field. And that plays out not just in who's getting hired, but also how the pay is being distributed across these fields. So if we look at non-STEM jobs compared to STEM jobs, of course, we're making more money on average than non-STEM jobs. But even here, women are only making 84 cents on every dollar that a man earns for equal jobs. So even when we are having women participate in this process, they're actually not being compensated or valued at the same level. Now, if we look at women who are employed at universities across different fields within STEM, you'll notice that in the biology fields, we're doing a little bit better, at least with our non-tenured faculty, than some of the other sciences or STEM fields. But if we look at tenured faculty across the board, we're actually doing quite poorly. And so we're seeing that even our highest numbers, only 22% of tenured faculty are women, suggesting that really there is some sort of systematic bias that's prohibiting them from being involved in STEM fields. Now, one of the things is that we often get told you don't look like a scientist. And as much as that may sound like, you know, something trivial, this study actually did a few things. What they essentially did is they took photos, 80 photos, actually from the web of actual tenure track or tenured faculty, and half were women and half were men from STEM fields, and they from elite research universities. And then they actually had participants who were naive to the target's occupation rate the photos for femininity and the likelihood of whether they were a scientist or an early child educator. Now, if we look at this graph along the top, the likelihood that they're a scientist, and the male targets mean that these are individuals that are male in their photographs, and female targets are individuals that are female in their photographs. And we asked the likelihood that they appeared masculine versus feminine, and whether they were likely to be a scientist or not. And what we can see is that men who look more masculine are more likely to be ranked as a scientist. And in addition, if we ask with female targets, female individuals, if you look more masculine, you're more likely to be considered a probable scientist. So we're already seeing some bias there, that not only is it that women are less likely to be involved in STEM, that you have to appear more masculine to even feel like you belong. And then if we look at the likelihood that you're considered a teacher, for male targets, there was essentially more male individuals, there was essentially no difference, and it didn't matter how masculine or feminine you appeared. But for women, the more feminine you appeared, the more likely you were to be considered, you know, indicated that you were an early childhood teacher. There is an impressive body of literature that shows that there's a bias against women in STEM. Most people associate math and science fields with being male, and humanities and arts fields with being female. And if you did any of those online bias tests, you can actually see how you yourself fit into this preconceived idea. Women in male jobs are often viewed as less competent than their male peers. when women are clearly competent, they're often considered less likable. And this is this idea that when men are very competent in their jobs, they're considered leaders, where women, when they're have the same attributes, they're often considered bossy. Women are people are less likely to ascribe credit to women than a man for the identical accomplishments. And on average, women are less likely to hire a woman than a man with identical qualifications. And I'll actually go into some examples of that later on. So I would argue that this is not a women's only issue. It's just that we have more data and publicity over other underrepresented groups, but there is some literature out there that does address some of these other underrepresented groups. So if we look at who's actually employed in STEM fields, you can see right off the bat that white men are disproportionately employed in STEM fields. Even if you take into account the population of the United States, really they are overrepresented. But again, you might look at this and say, well, this is from 2006. We've actually made a lot of headway. Our conversations have changed in the country. So now let's see what happens if we fast forward to 2015. The first thing that we see is that white men have only gone down by 6%. White women have no change at all. And we're actually seeing only slight increases across other underrepresented groups. So this doesn't bode well that actually, despite the fact that this is, these issues have come to the forefront, we aren't actually accumulating change very quickly. Now, one of the things we also know is that, of course, higher education has a big impact on how much you make. And so maybe it's not surprising that the more education you have, the higher your pay. But it also plays out in race and ethnicity. So if you're not white, you're less likely to make as much. And again, gender matters. And in all cases, females are making less than their male counterparts in their ethnic groups. Another thing that can impact people's ability to succeed in STEM is how, sort of the environment in which they grew up. So one of the things we see is that first gen and also often low income students really struggle more in college. And so this is an interesting study because the first two bars are the first generation students. And what they've done is they've used their reliance on financial aid as an indicator of their socioeconomic status. And so those that needed no aid at all are in the light blue, all the way through those that needed full aid are in the light purples. And what we see is across the board, the light purples are doing less well in sciences and in humanities. So the first set of bars are in the science and engineering fields, and the next is in humanities and social sciences. But I think the thing that surprised me the most is that in the next two set of bars, that second generation students also still sort of carry this legacy and are not performing as well in both STEM and in the humanities, suggesting that we really need to be aware that some of these, underrepresented traits, which are not visible, so you can't look at someone and know whether they're first generation or whether they're low income, are still having ramifications on their ability to succeed. Disability status is also something that people often don't consider, and we actually don't have as much data on it as we probably should. But if we look here at the employment status of scientists and engineers by disability status, we can see that, of course, without disabilities, you're more likely to be employed. And if you're with a disability, you're less likely to be in the labor force, which is pretty unfortunate. Now, if we look at underrepresented individuals as a percentage of full-time professors in STEM, what you'll notice is that across all institutions, they're doing slightly better than R1s. But I think it's pretty alarming that even at, in 2013, we still are at less than 5% at R1s for underrepresented people in full professor positions. So this really does sort of suggest that there's some, tremendous improvements we need to make. African Americans in particular are often underrepresented in STEM. And so if you look at the graph on the right, what this is showing us is the number of individuals that enrolled in medical colleges, and they're actually controlling for their percentage in the population. And in all cases, what we see is that only Asians are overrepresented according to their population as enrolling in these fields. And we see that both whites, blacks, and Hispanics are underrepresented, and the blacks and Hispanics severely underrepresented in their enrollment in biomedical programs. And even in my own field, we have, of course, diversity issues. And so this paper was published in 2019, and Joseph Graves was the first African-American or Black person to earn a Ph.D. in evolutionary biology. And so in this subfield of biology, we actually clearly are having some issues. And he wrote this really nice paper on sort of some of the issues he sees in evolutionary biology. And I believe at that time when he wrote the paper, there still were only less than 10 PhDs that were African-American in evolutionary science. We know that LGBTQIA status can also impact your ability to feel welcome in STEM fields. And so what we see is that we have lower retention for men who identify as LGBTQ. In this study, they didn't include the IA+. But that women were more likely to persist, LGBTQ women were more likely to persist in STEM fields than their heterosexual peers. And this is really having an impact on their sort of, not just their ability to thrive, but even their remaining in STEM programs. And so we see that people who identify as LGBTQIA are more likely to transfer to humanities programs than their heterosexual peers. And again, we know that stereotypes persist. We've already sort of mentioned that women in male jobs are viewed as less competent than their male peers. And when they are competent, they're less likable. And that women of color had to confront negative racial stereotypes often. And that Black women were more likely than other women to report a bleak sense of isolation. And so to me, that's really disheartening. And Latinas and Black women were often reported being mistaken for janitors or administrators, and men of color described similar experiences. Asians reported stereotypes, notably the forever foreign assumption. So regardless of how many generations their family has been in the United States, people assumed that English was likely not their first language. And that women and people of color are often held to higher standards of personal dress and appearance. And so I don't know about at your conferences, but at biology conferences, women and people of color often are dressed much more professionally and have to do so to be taken seriously than our white male peers. And so interestingly, you know, we may not be surprised to hear that, of course, across the United States or the world, that we have biases against women and people of color, but we often think that as scientists, we're going to be much more immune to these issues. And so this was a paper that was published in 2012, and what these faculty did, so they're actually science faculty at universities, they drafted two identical resumes or CVs and just changed the first name from Jennifer and John, and then sent them out to other science faculty at universities across the US and asked them to rank these applicants according to a whole series of traits. So they asked them questions like, you know, and I think they did it in the context of like, this is a trainee in my lab. I'm trying to help them prepare for the next steps after they graduate. Would you help us evaluate this resume? And they asked questions like, how likely are you to hire this individual? What would you pay this individual? If this individual worked for you in your lab, what would you be willing to provide access to additional trainings for this individual? And then had all of those evaluations sent back to them. And what they found across the board is that people were more likely to hire the male candidate, they were going to pay the male candidate more, and they were going to provide additional trainings to the male candidate more likely than the female. And maybe what was even more surprising in this is that they saw this bias play out both by male faculty, but also by women faculty. So women were also biased against the female candidate. And it turns out that there's other things that you can discern from names, of course. And in this case, there's a whole amazing body of literature in the business world that's been accumulating for a long time. And in this case, they essentially uploaded these 4 resumes for Emily, Greg, Lakeisha, and Jamal, and then had the opportunities for people to reach out to them to potentially employ them for jobs in their institutions. And what they saw is that the white names received 50% more callbacks for interviews than the other names did, despite the fact that the resumes were equal otherwise, suggesting that even here we have a bias against an assumption about race. Now, again, people often have said, you know, and especially to me, well, you know, we've changed the way we think a lot. We're improving greatly. We just need time. We need time to fix these issues, right? But what we see is that even if we look at just men and women, and I think it's the easiest data to look at because of the fact that we know that in our population across the US, we should be at 50-50. What we see is at the rate that we're increasing, it's going to take about 90 years to get to gender parity, let alone let's talk about all the other axes of diversity that we're not hitting. So the argument that we just have to wait is not enough. We actually have to be very proactive to overcome these issues. So why is it that we should all work to solve these? Well, one of the things that we know is there's currently not enough trained candidates to fill all the STEM jobs, both in academia and in industry and in government and NGOs. We do know that when you have diverse teams, it increases innovation, increases creativity and problem solving, and increases teamwork. We also know you're more likely to attract and retain talent, and that we really need all axes of diversity in our workforce. Now, diversity, you don't have to take my word on it when I say that diversity is beneficial to science. There's actually a few studies that have been done. And what this study did was they actually took tens of thousands of publications, and then they asked the question whether the authors of these publications were gender heterogeneous or not. And so essentially, was all the authors male, or were there male and female authors? Unfortunately, they couldn't use women-only authorship papers because there were not enough of them. But what they found is that you were more likely to be cited and have a longer staying impact if your working group was heterogeneous. In addition, we also have seen similar things play out with ethnic diversity. It also increases scientific impact. And interestingly, even when you get problem solvers, so in this case, they took groups of high ability problem solvers versus groups of diverse problem solvers, what they found is that the high ability problem solvers were actually outperformed by a diverse group of problem solvers just because of having unique perspectives on how to overcome these issues. There's also a blog that if you are interested in looking into this issue further. Now, one of the things we know is that encouragement goes a long way. So in this study, what they essentially did is they took groups of students and said, we're going to take a math exam, but before we take this exam, I just want to say, we know men are better at this task. And then they asked the question, you know, what was their assessment of their self-rating? What was the likelihood they were going to perform well? And maybe not surprisingly, the women considered that they were less likely to excel in this task. But when they took a separate group of individuals and then asked, you know, and did the same experiment, but told them that we know that there's no gender difference in performing this task, despite what you may have heard, suddenly the equity in performance was realized. Now, we also know that there's an issue for women winning prizes. So in this case, it's biomedical prizes. And what we see is in that first graph on the left, we see that, of course, we have a situation in which women are receiving less awards, especially from their big scientific societies. That when they do receive awards, and that's the graph in the middle, women are more likely to receive awards for service instead of research. And even when they do receive these awards, women are less likely to receive large amounts of prize money compared to their male counterparts. Now, you know, it's true across not just the biomedical fields, it's true across many different fields that we see that female Ph.D. candidates and even full professors are very underrepresented in who's receiving prizes. In this graph, even the highest amount, women are only receiving about 27% of all prizes compared to their male counterparts. So one thing I would recommend is that all of you should be nominating deserving women and underrepresented scientists for awards, and not just diversity and service awards. In addition, you have to remember that women and underrepresented groups are less likely to self-nominate or to ask others to nominate them. So there's a whole body of literature that's demonstrated that white males are more likely to self-nominate and feel confident enough to ask other people to nominate them. So think of deserving people that you know who might not be often represented in these awards. Now, one thing that we are seeing is that because these issues of diversity, equity, inclusion are becoming to the forefront, people are recognizing that we have to actively work to overcome them. But unfortunately, what we're seeing is that underrepresented faculty are playing a disproportionate role in advancing diversity and inclusion initiatives. And so white males need to be involved in these programs. So what are the barriers that are preventing success in STEM careers? Well, first, we know there's a lack of role models, right? We've seen that at the highest tiers, women and other underrepresented groups are only marginally included. We know that there's a lack of publicity aimed at women and underrepresented groups. There's a perceived lack of job opportunities, unfortunately, and often this is coupled with a lack of encouragement or family support for women and underrepresented groups. There's often once you are included, there's isolation and lack of support. And the lack of flexibility in part-time working can often disproportionately push out women in underrepresented groups who are more likely to be involved in childcare and aging parent care. We know that white male dominant culture can actually make it an unwelcome environment for people who may otherwise feel uncomfortable there. We also know that there can be a lack of confidence or an imposter syndrome for many people who are underrepresented in any field. And there, of course, is also a lack of mentors. But the great news is we can actually fix all of these things. So how do we solve these problems? Of course, one of the most important changes is related to policy. So we need to work to limit our effects of bias, both at the national, local, and institutional level, even in our own labs and lives. We have to acknowledge and work to reduce our own bias. We have to work to reduce the impact of bias from others by actively supporting other individuals, including being an active bystander. So we'll actually talk about what being an active bystander is. So how do we actually solve these problems? There's a few different tools that we can use. On an individual level, we can use something called priming. And so essentially what this is that once you've identified what your own biases are, you can work to overcome them, at least on the short term. So some of these biases that we have, especially if they're implicit biases, we may never be able to get rid of them. But we can do an exercise called priming to overcome them. So there's a woman who's been very active in diversity, equity, and inclusion work. And I saw her give this great talk. And in front of it was at one of our national meetings. So in front of a room of hundreds of individuals, she shared that when she took the implicit bias test, she's found that she's biased towards Black men. So she knows this about herself. And as much as she wishes it weren't true, it is in fact part of herself. So whenever she's going into any kind of decision-making or evaluation activities, she primes herself. So for example, if she's going to sit in on a faculty hiring committee and they're about to start evaluating the candidates, she'll remind herself that Black men are people like Barack Obama. And just by doing that exercise, it can actually help you overcome your bias in a short term. Now, if you really want to sort of help yourself overcome, like if you know that you're biased towards white men, you could play another exercise where you say white men are people like Donald Trump. But maybe not going that far isn't necessary for you, but really figuring out where your biases are and working to overcome them. We have to reorganize structures and systems. So we need to make sure that we're creating an environment that allows people of underrepresented groups not only to feel welcome, but that we actually are limiting our own bias behaviors. We need to have new forms of accountability. So we need to make sure we have diversity metrics to check for the potential bias and see when and if it's breaking down in the system and then working to overcome that. So what is an ally? So people often talk about, this, and I want to spend a moment to actually read this definition. An ally is someone from a non-marginalized group who uses their privilege to advocate for the marginalized group. They transfer the benefits of their privilege to those who lack it. You can only be an ally through action. So I want to, even though, by definition, ally is a noun, but I want you to remember that really an ally is a verb. And so there's this other side to it, which is performative allyship. And this is when someone from that same non-marginalized group professes support and solidarity with the marginalized group in a way that's either isn't helpful or actively harms the group. So performative allyship usually involves the ally receiving some kind of a reward. So maybe it's on social media, they get a pat on the back for being a good person or on the right side. So one thing you can do is you can ask the question, would you be doing this activity if your name was not divulged? So if no one could know that it was you performing this task. So 5 tips for being an ally is, and this is from a blog and video by Francesca Ramsey. And if you haven't watched it, I absolutely suggest that you do. You need to understand your privilege. So everyone has some form of privilege, and it doesn't mean that you're rich or that you had your life was easy and you've never had to work hard. There are some things in life that you'll just never experience or have to think about because of who you are. So you need to understand what your privilege is. You need to listen and do your homework. You need to speak up, not over. Recognize you will make mistakes and apologize if you do. You have to remember it's not about your intent, it's about your impact. So let's imagine you slip up and you tell some joke at a conference that you get called out on, maybe in the moment, or maybe somebody pulls you aside later. The thing that you need to remember is that it's about the impact you had. So you shouldn't sort of explain it away like, oh, I didn't mean anything. What I meant was, like, that doesn't matter. It actually, only the thing that matters is the impact. And again, remembering that ally is a verb. And so you can't say that you're an ally unless you're already doing the steps above. And sometimes it's just showing up. And so an example of that is all of our colleagues are paying attention to each other. So, you know, if maybe there's a diversity awards program at Cornell, if somebody in your department is receiving an award, just be there. You know, they notice who's there. So make sure that you're present at award ceremonies, at workshops, at town halls. Just be there to support and cheer. So coming back to this idea of an active bystander, a bystander is a person who observes a conflict or unacceptable behavior, and it might be something serious or minor, one time or repeated, but the bystander knows that the behavior is destructive or likely to make a bad situation worse. Where an active bystander actually takes steps to make a difference. So a few things to remember is that if it's unwanted, it is harassment, period. Despite your intent, if it's unwanted, it is harassment. Harassment is always defined by the point of view of the target, and the intent is not important. So let's give some examples of active bystander interventions. One way to respond is sort of in the moment, and the other way to respond is after the fact. So in the moment, you have to name or acknowledge the defense. You have to always talk from your own point of view, not the target's. You want to interrupt the behavior. You want to publicly support the person that was the target, and you want to remove the target or the harasser from the situation. So let's give an example of that. We're at a conference, and we're standing around in a group, and someone starts to tell a joke or does tell a joke that's inappropriate. So what you should do in that moment is you can say, I find that joke offensive, and here's why. Or maybe you're at a poster session and you see a male colleague maybe, you know, inappropriately sort of pressuring a younger woman into doing something. You can go interrupt that behavior. You can sort of interrupt them by both either taking the target away or taking the harasser away. So maybe, you know, you don't feel comfortable taking the target away. You say to the harasser, hey, I've been reading your papers. Could you join me for a minute so I could ask you a few specific questions, right? So you really want to make sure you're actively doing things. Sometimes you can't do something in the moment for a number of reasons. So there's things you can do after the fact. You can report the incident with or without names. You can talk privately to the harasser or talk privately to the target. So you might pull the harasser aside and say, hey, look, I don't know if you realize that joke was really offensive. Here's why, blah, blah, blah. Or maybe you pull the target away and just say, I want you to know that I didn't find it okay, and I'm sorry I didn't speak up in the moment. I sort of was at a loss for words. So really you need to make sure that you're always working towards limiting this inappropriate behavior. I'd also recommend all of you to join diversity in science groups, despite the fact that you may not identify as that particular underrepresented individual. So men should all be joining women in science groups. White people should all be joining science affiliated organizations that support people of color. If you're heterosexual, you could join some LGBTQIA groups. It's super important that you actually show that you're there in solidarity with these individuals. And so I'll share a personal story. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with softness, but it's the Society for the Advancement of Chicanos, Hispanics, and Native Americans in Science. And it's actually grown now to be one of the largest diversity science conferences in the world. And I have a couple of colleagues who are heavily involved in SOCNUS and even in the administration of the organization. And one year, many years ago, they were like, oh, Corrie, you should come to SOCNUS. And I was like, well, I don't know that I'm necessarily appropriate to be at the conference. And they said, what are you talking about? They always want allies. And I felt like such a jerk because I've been working on these issues for a long time and it just didn't occur to me. So I immediately joined SOCNUS. I'm a lifetime member now, and I go to their conferences whenever I can. This year it will be virtually. But I also was very delighted and surprised to see the large number of cis heterosexual white men that were there. And that's because their labs, their classrooms are filled with individuals that don't look like them. And so it's actually a great way to learn how to support people who are not like you. So how do we actually solve these issues? Hopefully I've been able to sort of touch on many of these points along the way, but you have to support policy changes that limit, reduce, and remove bias. At an individual level, you need to be aware of your own biases and work to overcome them. You need to encourage and actively support underrepresented groups in STEM fields. And remember that mentors and role models are both very important, and that you should find one if you're from an underrepresented group, and you should serve as one regardless of who you are. You should nominate women and people of color and other underrepresented scientists for awards. You should ensure diversity in all admissions, hiring, and promotion committees, so to help make sure that you have another individual in the room helping check the balance on that. You should support and join women in science and diversity groups regardless of your own background. And always remember that being an ally is an action, not an identity. So here's a list of some online resources. It's not exhaustive, but it'll be at the end of the slide should you want to investigate this further. So if there's time, I'd be happy to take questions, hear observations. I'd love to know what any of you guys are all doing to overcome these issues. Please feel free to jump in.
Thank you. Everybody can unmute for a second.
Thank you.
It's difficult on Zoom for sure. Questions?
Can we get a copy of your talk?
Absolutely.
Okay.
I'll be sure to send it to Joan and she can forward it around to everyone.
So based on the leaky pipeline you had shown before, if we're wanting to increase diversity within academia, we really need to be focusing on sort of recruiting undergraduate women and people of color and effectively integrating them into the lab, having them experience research, understand that it is for them, is what I'm gathering.
Yes, absolutely. But we should also be doing it at the faculty level, right? I mean, as we're making hires, we should make sure that we have people who can serve as role models to those individuals. I think that we often talk about women in science because it's an easier issue to talk about. I mean, every person in the world knows a woman. So, you know, you can sort of see how they should be treated equal. Oftentimes biases actually come from lack of exposure. And so you may not have, you know, grown up around a particular individual, and so you're just unfamiliar to you. The other thing to keep in mind is that depending on your corner of STEM, the underrepresented groups might be different. So in ecology and evolutionary biology, Asians are actually underrepresented in my field, despite the fact across STEM they're not underrepresented, right? So we have to actively think about that when we're making hires or recruiting students. So I think it's just that you'll have to assess your own field, your own lab, your own department, and try to work to increase the representation.
Got it. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. I just want to say there are no stupid questions. There are no inappropriate questions. If you have a question, I guarantee someone else also has that same question. The number of times I've given these talks and then someone will email me afterwards and say, could you define that word you used? And then I realized, like, I wish you would have asked it because I'm sure other people didn't know that word or don't know how to overcome this issue.
I have a question.
Sure.
Could you talk a little bit about what specific concrete things have been done in your department and in your workplace, and like what's worked well to improve conditions along these axes, and maybe some other things that haven't worked as intended?
Making bold statements that you value diversity and that being the end of it doesn't work. We know that. And that has happened a lot over the last couple of decades. One of the things we know is you have to actively work on it, both as individuals, but also as, you know, a community of scientists. So in our own department, we've created a diversity, equity, and inclusion committee who's tasked with ensuring that at all levels that we're accounting for diversity. So whether it's a hiring committee, whether it's graduate admissions, undergraduate admissions, who's being invited for seminar speakers, we're trying to keep an eye on sort of what we're representing science to look like. We've also asked, as a department, we've created a diversity, equity, inclusion statement for the department, which is on our website. We also are now working on an anti-retaliation policy. We also have asked individual PIs to come up with their own lab guidelines, addressing not just their thoughts on sort of number of hours worked and you know what they value and how that many times they can expect to meet with a PI, but also include diversity statements in those individual lab documents. It does force you to take a step back and think about your accountability towards those things. In our own diversity, in our own department, we actually have a racial justice reading group. We actually just finished reading this book. And it's an excellent book, especially if you're new to these conversations. They have whole chapters on privilege. She has whole chapters on microaggressions. It's a really informative book. And actually the audiobook is also really good in it, and if you're interested. And so I'd advocate for all of us to continue to improve and learn. We can't leave the task of increasing diversity on the marginalized groups. That's unfair, and it also means we won't actually change, because in many of our communities there aren't enough voices to sort of pursue change. The other thing is that you have to value the underrepresented individuals in your departments, in your lab groups, in your scientific societies, and that means by raising them up and giving them a voice. And that means sometimes we have to just be quiet, which for many of us in academia can be very difficult. I hope that I've addressed your question, and if not, please let me know and I'll try to add some more information.
Yeah, thanks. That's very helpful. I guess the only quick follow-up I'd ask is, you mentioned that committee in your department. So if they do their research and they see that something needs to change with the admissions procedure, or with something else that could be better in the department climate, for instance, how does that proceed from there? Do they have jurisdiction to change the admissions process and do other things like that? Or how does the process go?
Yeah, so one thing is that our chair of our department is very supportive of this committee, so values their input. So is our DGS, our graduate admissions officer, for those of you not at Cornell. And the other thing about that committee is that it's not just faculty. So again, that would be this top-down sort of approach. So we actually have graduate students, postdocs, staff on that committee as well, because we all need, we need as many eyes looking at these issues as possible, because there could be something that I would miss entirely because I'm not a staff member, but I might inadvertently be reinforcing, which could lead to lack of equity and inclusion in my own department.
Sounds great. Thanks so much.
Of course.
Corrie, do you have suggestions for how we can be more inclusive as a very remote organization, since we have people from all over the US and most of our meetings are via Zoom, even pre-pandemic? Do you have suggestions on how we can increase that?
Sure. I mean, one thing you could do is think carefully about who you're inviting to participate and also who you're inviting to speak. So ensuring that you're always having diversity, especially at the highest level. So if you have keynotes, if you have prestigious awards, being mindful of the fact of who you're inviting to be involved in those things, because it is a reflection of what you guys are as an organization to those that are involved, but also to those that are not involved. And so you can imagine that if you guys were just a group of one type of individual, other individuals, even if invited to join, might look at you and say, I don't think I belong. And so you really have to think about what kind of, sort of front you're putting out towards the, of the rest of the world. The other thing is that you could think about creating some resources just to increase diversity in your organization. So if you have an opportunity to create fellowships, could you create a diversity fellowship to invite more people to be engaged in your field? Those are the kinds of things you can begin to think about. Anytime you have an opportunity to build on something, whether it's requires financial backing or not, making sure that you're thinking about diversity and equity. And, even as an organization, you might have a diversity, equity, and inclusion subcommittee of your group. But the thing there is you have to empower them. You can't just have them there and then look at them and go, why aren't things fixed? You actually have to give them the ability to make suggestions and then to be implemented.
Thank you.
So to sort of follow up on that, you've mentioned or in the talk that it's a lot easier to be cognizant of increasing diversity and the inclusion of women because everyone knows a woman, whereas certain races and ethnic groups can effectively fall through the cracks. Is there, because we are all over the US, is there some sort of regional breakdown of like in the Southwest versus Northeast and so far on of representation so that we can be extra cognizant of those who would be most likely to fall through the cracks depending on our location?
Well, I think you could think about it in the context of what does the percentage of your population look like and are you reflecting it? So in the Southwest, we have a huge Hispanic population. Are your institutions looking like the community around you? The other thing is that there are lots of programs at our institutions that we might not be aware of that would be opportunities to engage, especially undergraduates, but also graduate students in opportunities in our research labs. So at Cornell, once a year, we usually have in the fall, it's a gathering of all the graduate diversity organizations on campus, and everyone's invited to come and learn about these organizations. And so when I've gone and interacted with people, I remember I met someone who's in charge of the disability, the Students with Disabilities office on campus. And I was saying to him that, if he has great students who would love to come and do research, reach out to me. We all need more hands in the lab. And he was shocked to hear that, because the thing that he struggles with most is that students with disabilities have the hardest times getting into STEM labs. And so, that's an obvious thing that we can all do, is to ensure that we're, working with our own institutions. They often have, African-American student organizations or, first generation and low income organizations, just bringing those people to get engaged in science early. We know that earlier we engage them, the more likely they are to stay.
Got it. Thank you.
Hi, this is Lippy. Thanks so much for your talk. I really appreciated seeing what you were presenting. I wanted to bring up 2 points. One point I wanted to just share some thoughts on was, I think there's this issue with, especially in science, of this idea, especially, some of the things you presented about minorities being, with the same qualifications still being seen as less hireable and so forth. And I think because of that, I think that the strategy of using a primer to prepare yourself going into something like a hiring opportunity or something is really important. But I also think it's important to not promulgate this idea of a model minority, or this idea that a Black man has to be Obama in order to be worthy of our time. And so I think it's really important that everybody in our center and in general tries to remember that a Black man can be just who he is and is still deserving of our time. And same with a Black woman or a Hispanic person or any of these people. They don't have to be, the highest office of their career in order to be considered. I also think something that came out of the APS did a webinar called From Passion to Action a couple of weeks ago, and Professor James Gates was there. And he shared a story about how when he was at, I think it was in Caltech, he was trying to go to his lab in the evening, and the police showed up and actually pulled a gun on him because they didn't think he belonged there. And so he told us, you know, he's an extremely celebrated theoretical physicist, but he said, I could have died that night because the security didn't think I belonged on the Caltech campus. They thought I was an intruder. And so something that came up during that talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion was somebody genuinely, a white professor, not at the talk, but had sort of submitted a question saying, what does a Black person or a Black man being shot on the street have to do with more Black people in STEM? Those things don't make sense to me. Like, how is that going to help anything? And the point is that they made was, of course this matters. If you see every person on the street that doesn't look like you as someone who doesn't belong or isn't, you know, a citizen or part of your community, you're more likely to consider them as just being disposable, or, you know, it doesn't really matter. So I think that there's a very deep impact between diversity and inclusion, especially of Black and Brown people in science, and their lives outside of academia. And I just want to make that point very clear. Thank you so
Absolutely.
much. I really appreciated your talk, and I appreciated being able to share that.
No, I'm really glad you brought those things up. And I think that people often want to make a disconnect between what we do in our research lives as it's unrelated to the rest of the world. And unfortunately, that's not true. So if any of you guys are on social media, in the last few weeks, there's been a hashtag Black in the Ivory, and it's individuals sharing the macro and microaggressions that have happened to them in, you know, academia only. And you'll be outraged to hear the sort of things that happen. And I think you'll also be surprised to hear that some of the microaggressions are likely things that you've said yourself, and you may not have realized the negative impact they have. And so I think people need to think about, you know, people are always like, well, who cares about microaggressions? But I think the thing that you have to remember is, you know, not only is it the impact, not the intent, but it's also death by 1,000 cuts. It's not the one thing that's going to kill you. It's the fact that you have to hear these things over and over, again, reinforcing that you don't belong. And so I'd recommend all of you you have to continue to self-educate. The other thing is that if you're from an overrepresented group, and whichever axis that is, if there are opportunities to learn or participate in diversity, equity, inclusion events, you should absolutely be there. Sign up for those events, go to those mixers. I mean, it's not only about, you know, sort of showing support, but it's also about educating yourself. I mean, all of us still can learn more.
So maybe here's a question. All of us, or many of us, are involved sometimes in things like graduate admissions, and then there's the hiring process. And you've talked about priming as one thing you can do, but I'm guessing that that's not enough, and that there are other measures that need to happen in order to have really inclusive hiring and admissions processes. Can you talk a little bit about what some of those other effective strategies are?
Sure. So I'm not an expert in that, I will say. Most of our institutions have trainings for ensuring that we're reducing bias when we're participating in these kinds of activities. And so you should absolutely sign up. Even if you're not going to be on a hiring committee this year, those activities are really informative. One of the things that we have to know is whether we're evaluating candidates appropriately. So recognizing that someone who, you know, I often hear people say, we just want to hire excellence, like, you know, and to me, that's sort of a pointless conversation, because the strengths that someone brings are diverse. No one gets hired exclusively to do research and nothing else, right? And so you have to recognize what they might be contributing to the department outside of research alone. I think if we took at candidates and only sort of set the threshold as to who's appropriate research-wide, we'd still end up with a giant pool of applicants from diverse backgrounds. So now asking the question, what else can they bring to the department is important. You also have to recognize that you may have your own biases about expectations of what you think, you know, is a threshold, and then whether that's appropriate or not to a department is something different. You might also ask the question, am I entering this with some kind of bias about, you know, where I think people should be publishing or what institutions they should have gone to school? I mean, we know that that actually impacts our ability to evaluate people fairly. We also might want to control for the fact that some people have not had access to as much resources as others. And it doesn't mean that they couldn't thrive in an amazing environment. So for example, on a recent hiring committee, we were evaluating candidates and one person looked particularly promising, although a couple people raised that, well, they didn't do X, Y, and Z. But at the same time, if you looked at where they did their PhD, it was at a very small university in the, you know, southern part of the US, where we know they didn't have access to many of those resources. So we still brought them in for an interview because of course, when they got here, they were dynamic and amazing. And, you know, unfortunately we lost them to another institution, but you know, that's the kind of thing where on paper you might say, well, they don't have as many publications or they don't have all the techniques. The other thing that we've also seen is that when you're evaluating, try to understand, you know, some people have these really dynamic applications and they've written amazing letters and they've come out of some of the best labs. And then you'll sometimes read one where you're like, well, research-wise they look great, but all their other ancillary materials are actually quite of poor quality. And that's because they haven't had the mentorship. They didn't go to an institution where they had trainings and workshops and, you know, a PI who had gone through all of these things. And so I think being aware that you can still have excellence, but control for access to opportunity and resources, and recognize that once they get to our institutions, they're gonna thrive. Any other questions, comments? I'm always learning. So if you guys know amazing tricks or tips or things you've done yourself, I'm always open to hearing about them.
Is there other good reading or resources? Because you've emphasized the importance of kind of being an active investigator into these questions. And I think you mentioned, so you want to talk about race. Are there other resources that you've found helpful?
I mean, of course, being a scientist, I sort of started this whole thing by reading the scientific literature. And so I think I know there are lots of amazing research papers out there across these topics. So if you're interested, you can always continue to pursue them. There are amazing resources that are about issues of racism. So even though you might say, well, it's not about STEM racism, it still pertains. And so I think any opportunity to read books that are you know, dealing with issues about race. I'm just about to start reading The New Jim Crow, which has been highly recommended. And so, I mean, despite the fact that, you know, I like to say that I'm not racist and I like to believe that, I suspect that just being raised in the environments in which we have, there's parts and corners of me that that's true. And even if I could say definitively, like, no, I have no issues of racism across any axes in my body, it doesn't mean I shouldn't learn so that I can help educate other individuals. I think it's interesting that in science, we all know that we have to continue to learn new techniques and we have to read new papers and we have to sort of keep abreast with what's the new emerging technologies in our field. But when it comes to issues in society, we sort of think that whatever I got in the past is enough. And that, you know, I don't have to continue to work and improve. And that's not in fact true. That if we want to be good citizens in our own departments, and if we want to see STEM reflecting all of the axes of diversity that absolutely should be here and will contribute to a more beneficial and productive community, then we have to continue to work. And for those of you at Cornell, I'm going to be teaching, I'll be leading a seminar about the science of bias. And so we'll be reading from the primary literature across some of these issues related to the diversity in STEM. And so I'm assuming it's going to be remote. So all of you are welcome to to participate if that's interesting to you. Lippy, you have your hand raised?
Sorry, that was for earlier.
Oh, sorry, I didn't notice it earlier.
So Corrie, this is Sandra Biedron. How are you? Great talk. I asked
Thank
for it. I
you.
already emailed you about it too. You know, it echoes, I mean, we all, I think, that are from underrepresented groups have, you know, we could write blogs upon blogs of all the experiences we've had. So one of the things that I think women in particular deal with, because they have the primary caregiving role, is like during this COVID, how do you think, you know, before there was like all the stigma, oh, if you have a baby, you can't stay at home. This, how could you actually work from home? How is this possible? How do you think COVID's going to transform child rearing, taking care of disabled children or parents? How do you think labor laws could change on this? Like you don't, like right now, if you take parental leave, you basically are not supposed to be doing work. And that plays into like all kinds of psychological problems for women, because they just like, they're working pregnant and then they have to give up everything and just only take care of one thing. So that can actually lead to like postpartum depression and everything like that. Tell me what you think will happen with COVID. Like there's no more excuses for certain genders to come down on women.
Yeah, I wish it was easy to say. I think policy, and this is a situation in which I think policy is the only effective way we're going to overcome issues around parental leave. So in societies where parental leave is mandatory for both parents, we know that the stigma goes away and people are not penalized for not working. And those are the only situations in which I know that that's effectively true. Even in the US, where we have institutions that allow for male parental leave, in most cases, the stigma around it is so negative that I have a colleague who actually took it and then he still felt like he had to go into his lab every day because, you know, his colleagues were making comments to him. And so I think, and even when women take parental leave, you know, they're pressured into continuing to try to work while they're home. And I think that that's unrealistic. And I think that when you have leave, I think there should be no questions about why you're taking it. If your institution at the HR level allows you to take leave, then whether it's for caring for an aging parent or whether your partner's ill or whether you have small children at home, I think the question shouldn't be, you know, there shouldn't be any stigma around it or expectations that you continue to work. Regarding COVID, I think there was a paper that just came out in Nature this last week that showed that they went through the archives, all the different archives that people are uploading papers, and they've already shown that women are uploading less papers during COVID, so as a proxy for publication or research output. And because they're at home with more duties, and I think that the problem there isn't just COVID. So let's imagine that we get a vaccine and it ends tomorrow. The long-term impacts for a decrease in research productivity has huge impacts for raises down the line and promotions down the line and receiving awards and actually receiving grant funding. Those things are all going to have ripple effects that are not just happening during COVID, but can play out through an entire career of a scientist. And so I think being mindful of the fact of expectations is important, but I think we'll only overcome it if we actually invoke policy change in this case.
Thank you.
Just to follow up on a question that Richie asked about resources, if any of these topics have piqued your interest, I guarantee you there's a deluge of resources out there. I sort of came into this because I got actively involved in women in science conversations. So I was a graduate student at Harvard when Larry Summers, who was the president at Harvard at the time, made disparaging comments saying that women didn't have the same innate aptitude and ability as males in STEM fields. And that's what really spurred me to get involved in these conversations. I probably spent the next 10 years really only thinking about issues of women in science. But of course, as I continued on that journey, I started to realize that wasn't the only axis of diversity missing in the conversation. And so that's pushed me to continue to read. You know, I have friends who are LGBTQIA, and so they're more interested in those issues. I have people who are from, you know, who are Native American or who are Hispanic, who are more interested in those issues. And I think it's okay to focus, but being mindful that as you're raising one group up, you have to raise everyone up. That you can't say, well, let us solve the women in science issue first, and then we'll get to the other axes of diversity. That will never happen. We know that, you know, the data shows that that doesn't happen. So you have to sort of say, okay, I'm from an underrepresented group, or I'm from an overrepresented group, but I want to ensure that everyone feels welcome, and I want their contributions based exactly on who they are. And I think to the point that Lippy made about the model minority, you know, we shouldn't have expectations that everyone talks like us, looks like us, walks like us, dresses like us. I want people to show up exactly who they are and bring with them those strengths. And so I think that we have to all continue to read and work. And there are publications coming out every week on issues of diversity, especially in STEM, but just in general. And so I think we can all continue to learn.
So you showed a graph of 2006 in comparison to 2015 and that very small change. Are there specific things that are happening now that make you optimistic that we will see a greater shift in the next 10 years?
Yeah, to some extent. I think the conversation is much more public now and open than it was before, and that people who have bad behaviors are held much more accountable. We also know that at most institution levels now, there's initiatives and committees on diversity, equity, inclusion in a way that were not present in the past. I also want to sort of highlight that, you know, that graph that I showed, I mean, that's still like less than a 10-year window. And so people still say, well, maybe that's not enough time. So I actually just published 2 postdocs in my group where we got invited. It's a very small journal, but we got invited because we had been at this Ecology conference, which is just the study of ants. I know that that sounds crazy, but there were hundreds of people there. But we were having a conversation about how there still weren't enough women at the highest levels, and even in our own field. And so we got asked to write this paper. And what we did is we essentially, there was a landmark book published 30 years ago called The Ants by E.O. Wilson and Bert Holdobler. And we said, well, look, that was it sort of spurred a lot of people to start to study ants. So we actually went through and downloaded all the publications that mentioned the word ant or Formicidae or whatever related to our field, and then analyzed, had the numbers of women increased as either first author or last author. And what we see is that at the last author position, those senior positions, it hasn't increased at all in 30 years from the average. So, and even for the first author positions, which are often more junior level scientists, what we saw is that we're only seeing a short increase in the most recent years. That's it. So I think time alone is not going to fix it. You have to actively work to sort of make these changes. And so, you know, I think that pushing our institutions to hold us all accountable is important. Invoking policy change is important. Being actively involved in increasing diversity in your own departments is important. I often hear from white men that they feel that they shouldn't be in those spaces because they feel like they don't belong. But without your participation, and not just support, but participation, we're not going to move the needle. So, you know, and we want you there. We want white men who are champions and allies of underrepresented groups there to help us fight this battle. I mean, we can't rely on the underrepresented groups to do all the work, both because now they have to sort of perform at our level of expectations for research and teaching, but now they have, in addition, double the amount of service, and also a whole bunch of service you don't see because those underrepresented groups are often relying on them for support outside of the official sort of mentoring and committee requirements. And so, I mean, I don't know. I think that really without change across all levels, we won't see the needle move much more than it's been moving.
Thank you.
thank you very, very much for an enlightening and very interesting and important talk. We really appreciate it.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I think it's a good sign that your group is already open to having these kinds of conversations at your annual meetings. So hopefully you guys have a productive rest of your meeting.
Thank you very much. And really thank you for taking the time to come and meet with us.
Absolutely. All right, you guys, it was nice to meet all of you.